My name is Ross Baker. I'm the pastor at Eudora and Edgerton United Methodist Churches, and on behalf of the network, it's great to have you all out. I understand this workshop size is maybe a little bit smaller than maybe the next group, Kirsten, but I understand all of the presenters said, they were very open to various size groups, so I'm glad that we're here. We are blessed to have Dr. Kirsten Watkins with us. She's the Director of Adult Services at the Bert Nash Community and Mental Health Center, where she supervises all therapy teams, including our intensive outpatient program and DBT program, and the admissions team. She completed her undergraduate degree at Southwestern University in Georgetown, Texas, and played on the women's soccer team. She completed her master's in counseling psychology at the University of North Texas and her doctorate in clinical psychology at the University of Denver. She has worked as a clinician in many different settings, including prisons, the Virginia Rape Crisis Centers, and the University of Kansas. Most of her work has been related to trauma treatment, specifically combat trauma, military sexual trauma, childhood sexual trauma, acute stress experiences, and complex traumas. She provides and trains other clinicians on evidence-based treatment interventions for trauma and provides psychological testing services at Bert Nash. Dr. Kirsten Watkins, welcome this morning.
Thank you, guys. It's so nice to be here, and it is nice to have a small group because there's an opportunity to have any discussion, any questions that you might have. I am really happy to be here and to participate in any opportunity to help the community learn about mental health issues and be able to just support the people in our community. So today my task is, I think she mentioned in the intro earlier, 10,000 view perspective of mental health treatment. So I tried to jam all of that into this tiny bit. So again, please stop me. We can make this as flexible and as open and conversational as possible. So my agenda, some of the stuff I was thinking of covering today is to recognize signs of mental health challenges. I also want to share a little bit about the Bert Nash services because those services are available to you and to the people that you work with, and also how to access those services. So some specific details about that. Okay, next one. Okay, so we got to start off with how do you recognize signs of mental health issues? And for most of this presentation, just so you know, because we also are human beings, I focus this on recognizing it in yourself and also recognizing these things in the people around you in whatever capacity you're around other people. So next one. And by the way, sorry, some of this is pretty small. I wasn't sure how big the screen would be, so I'll make sure to cover this, and if you can't read anything, let me know. But mental illness references a wide variety of things. We are human beings, and part of being a human being is feeling things and experiencing things, the good, the bad, the ugly, throughout our lives. So no one that's a human being goes throughout their lives without experiencing any level of emotional distress or challenges in their lives. That's a core part of our experience as humans. But mental health conditions reference when those experiences, when those emotional experiences, when those thinking processes get impacted to a level that starts to interfere with your life. And it might start to interfere with your relationships, it might start to interfere with your work, it might start to interfere with your behavior or your thinking. So again, most people have some experience with mental health problems at some point in their life, and it may not reach a severity level that requires professional treatment, but no person is immune to any kind of mental health struggles throughout their life. The last one, if you are feeling that you're struggling with mental health issues in a manner that's different than usual, or that's impacting your ability to focus or perform in other arenas of your life, or is impacting you in a way that's maybe more severe or more overwhelming, then that might be the initial signs that there's a mental health issue going on. One of the things that I think is really important at the outset to recognize too is that emotional pain is subjective. What is extremely painful emotionally to me, like a 10 out of 10, might be a different rating for someone else. And there's many different reasons for those subjective ratings. But emotional pain is very similar to physical pain. And I'm sure each of you have been to a doctor at some point, and the doctor asked you to rate your physical pain on a 0 to 5 or a 0 to 10. When a doctor asks you to do that, they're not asking you because there's some clear understanding about what a 5 means or what a 10 means. They're asking because they want to get a sense of what that means for you. And so I think a basic scale for yourself or the people around you to quantify in some ways the magnitude of that current experience is really helpful. So on this scale, we have 0 to 10. 0 is no pain, 10 is unspeakable, unimaginable pain. Most people in their lives do not spend a lot of time in 0 to 10. They may touch those experiences at some point, but most of us spend our lives somewhere between the 1 to 9 scale. What I think, again, is really important about a scale like this is to check in with oneself or other people about that specific moment, but also to track trends in this. There might be a trend for someone where they're in the 6, 7, 8, 9 range for an extended period of time, and that's a concerning place to be. That's a place where your life, your relationships, your work, your daily living would start to be impacted significantly. Most people without mental health issues, again, might touch some of the 6 to 7 range, but they're kind of floating between the 1 and 2 and 6, floating amongst this scale. So again, a good opportunity to check in with yourself or other people of where exactly is that emotional pain for you, and what does that mean for you? Okay, next one. So I think this slide is important because mental health issues could present themselves in any number of ways. There is a really strong connection between our mind and our body. So I would say a large portion of the people that I work with first seek treatment with a medical provider before finding their way to my office. And the reason for that is because there's many ways that our body expresses that that emotional pain that I was referencing earlier. So on the top left side, we have some examples of physical symptoms that might be a representation of mental health symptoms for people, especially if these are things that come on suddenly or things that are unusual for that person. So headaches, typically that's a reflection of tension that people are experiencing. Teeth grinding, again, that kind of tension in your body. Sore jaw, also fatigue in bodies. They found that people who have experienced traumas, as just one example, tend to hold more stress and tension in their muscles, more so than people who have not experienced a trauma. So that means there's a resting body tension in people's muscles, even when nothing stressful is happening. Insomnia, difficulty sleeping, so that could be difficulty falling asleep, that could be difficulty staying asleep. Again, as human beings, we have to sleep. If you're not getting sleep consistently, that really impacts our functioning. People can't think in the same ways. They can't engage in their life. They can't remember things in the same way if they're not getting sleep. Again, a lot of people hold tension in their body. So when people are feeling emotional distress, sometimes they'll carry that tension in a certain part of their body. So for me, just as an example, I carry that in my shoulders and in my neck. When that gets tense for me, that's a sign that something is going on with me emotionally and mentally. That's the first sign. Stomach problems is another one. That's a really common expression of mental health issues with gastrointestinal problems. So kind of the classic butterflies in the stomach or pit in the stomach, feelings of nausea. All of those sometimes are paired with fear and anxiety. Those are really common expressions of mental health issues. And appetite changes. So obviously when all these things are happening that we might be feeling in our body, it might result in us being more hungry. Sometimes that's when people are feeling some kind of void or something that that feels uncomfortable for them and they're wanting to soothe themselves with food. It could be the opposite, where people are experiencing nausea and not interested in food and their appetite decreases. So those might be some physical health signs that would be signs of mental health issues. If we go to the bottom, emotional signs, this really is the spectrum. And again, this reflects, I think, how we are as human beings. There's no one sign. It's not like everyone who has mental health issues is crying. Some people who have mental health issues are expressing that with more anxiety, some people with more frustration, tension, mood swings. Some people are more angry or irritable. Their patience is noticeably less than maybe a time when they had less stress going on in their lives. So there's lots of different ways that that might come out for someone. On the top right side are more mental signs in terms of how you're functioning cognitively. So when people are overwhelmed with something, it consumes their brain. Think about any time that maybe you've been stressed about something or you've been really upset about something. It's hard to focus on other things in your life. And so when people are experiencing mental health crises, they typically are forgetful, they have difficulty concentrating on things. They might have a negative attitude and focus on the negatives, have a lot of difficulty seeing any of the positives that are right in front of them. They might feel boredom, they might feel pessimism. This sense of brain fog is something that happens when people feel overwhelmed. It's like, I can't see clearly. I'm so overwhelmed with all the things that are going on for me that I can't see what's right in front of me. I feel foggy and almost unable to make any decisions. The bottom right side are social and behavioral symptoms. These are things to maybe look for in yourself or others that might be signs of a problem if it's different than usual. So if maybe someone is typically friendly and engaging and suddenly they're pulling away, they're isolating more, they might be expressing feelings of loneliness because they're not connecting with other people. They might be avoiding people or things or situations in ways that maybe they wouldn't otherwise. They might be lashing out. These might be the people who have the more irritability, anger expressions, who are lashing out, who are more angry, and maybe perhaps mean to the people around them in ways that are different than usual. And also changes in behavior or motivation. So maybe people would typically be doing certain activities and they're no longer interested in that. They'd typically be motivated to do certain things and they're no longer interested in that. So these are just some of the signs. And part of what you might be seeing or thinking right now is that, man, there's no one thing. I wish there was like one flag that was waving and we could be like, yes, that's what that is. But this looks very different in different people. Okay, ready for the next one? Okay, so just to summarize a little bit about what to look for yourself and others, there are three main categories here. The top one is changes in engagement. So this is what I was referencing before of someone who is suddenly different in how they're engaging. Maybe they're more withdrawn, maybe they're more angry, maybe they're more avoidant of things, maybe they're less motivated. The bottom one is changes in behavior or appearance. So there is a lot to be said about how our outside reflects our inside. And if people are taking less care of themselves, if they're not engaging in self-care in the same way, if they're looking more tired, typically you can see some things physically on the outside that, again, are reflections of what's going on the inside. And then the top one is references to risk or harmful situations. So this might be people dropping comments about things that they might want to do or things that they're thinking about or maybe things that they've done in the past. This might be you witnessing people engaging in more risky behaviors that's not typical to things that they've done before. So that could be more risky relationship engagement and behavior. That could be more risky driving behavior, more risky substance use behavior. Anything that seems different or slightly out of the norm or maybe more elevated in intensity than maybe what you've seen before for that person. Any questions about this so far? Yeah, go for it.
I'm curious. I mean, so many of these things touch upon, with the pandemic, that need, the place in which people were forcibly being
Yeah.
isolated. And I think there's still even, I think today actually we were talking before. This marks year 3.
Yeah.
Since the pandemic initially began. But I see as a pastor, there's still some that I likely deal with anxiety and things around. Is it safe to even come back out? And the engagement piece in particular, seeing I imagine within your work as well, you've seen a lot of rise in mental health. I mean, I know that we've seen that even within our own kids as well.
Yes.
Within the school systems, but. So I'd just be curious, kind of where, I mean, is there one particular thing you're seeing more of at this point, or kind of where things are now? Are things beginning to get better? I mean, now that we're, or maybe not at that point yet.
Well, it's hard for me to say because the glimpse that I see are the people that are coming in for treatment. Yeah, so I'm typically seeing the flood of people, but it is a flood. The volume of people requesting and needing mental health services was already increasing prior to the pandemic. In many mental health settings, we were struggling with how to keep up. In the pandemic, it exacerbated any problems that I think were already there. And now, 3 years in, I think we've all been thinking that would curb, and it has not curbed. It is not curbed. And I mean, I could talk about this for a while. I think there's some pros and cons. Certainly, I think it allowed us to see more clearly the significant impact of mental health issues on people, and allowed people to see that in themselves. When people were isolated, they felt it. They felt the magnitude of all the things that maybe they were skilled at avoiding when life was pre-pandemic. So in one way, I think it really elevated awareness and it motivated people to get help. On the other hand, I think it has, again, exacerbated some things that we experienced before. And you mentioned social media. That has fanned some flames, especially for the younger generation who are trying to figure out their mental health and their relationships and their identity, and that has not helped. So, yeah, of course. Okay, stop me at any time. Okay, next one, please. So my intention, again, for this overview is to spend the next couple of slides just going through some of the most common diagnoses, because you may or may not be familiar with these things, but my belief is that if you have some awareness of it, then that gives you an opportunity to see it in yourself and other people. So one of the most common diagnoses is called general anxiety disorder, or GAD is what we call it. Generalized anxiety disorder is that in itself. It's generalized anxiety across multiple settings. So this is not someone who's having anxiety with just one particular type of setting or one particular type of intervention. This is someone who's experiencing pretty chronic symptoms of anxiety across multiple domains. Typically, people will feel some physiological symptoms associated with anxiety, like that restlessness, increased muscle aches and tension. You can see that at the top. Lots of people with this type of anxiety will experience what we call rumination, where their brain gets stuck on something and they ruminate. They go over and over and over and over that thing. So anxiety disorders in general are disorders in which your brain is focused on the future. It gets stuck thinking about the future. Depression is more focused on the past, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then some other things are focused on the present. Anxiety is exclusively thinking about the future, what might happen, what could happen, what's going to happen, what if that happened. And really, again, getting stuck on going over and over and over that. The impaired, sleep, on the bottom right. Typically what that looks like for people with this type of anxiety disorder is difficulty falling asleep because their mind doesn't shut off. They're thinking about all the things. They're maybe reflecting on some things from the day and analyzing that, but mostly anticipating things that are coming up and wrapping themselves up in anxiety about things that are coming up in the future. Sometimes people will also wake up from sleep, and usually early, wake up before their alarm because they're feeling the anxiety already about the day ahead. Any questions about that one? Okay, next one, please. Again, this is pretty small, so I'll try to explain it a little bit. So you may have heard, and people talk about this a lot, anxiety and also panic attacks. So these are related, but they're different. And the main thing that's different about them is the severity level. So if I experience an anxiety attack, that's a surge of that anxious distress, that anxious thinking, some of the physiological anxiety symptoms, like maybe my heart is racing, maybe I feel some like butterflies in my stomach, maybe I start sweating or get flush, those kinds of things. Panic attacks are that, excuse me, times 100. Typically, if someone is experiencing a panic attack, it's very sudden, it's very extreme. They typically have no idea what prompted that experience. Lots of people with panic attacks find themselves in the ER because they think they're having a heart attack or think there's something like a medical emergency. But really, it's a surge of anxiety experiences that are going on within their body. So on this one on the left, you can see some shared symptoms. The shared symptoms are increased heart rate and shortness of breath. So you maybe know this, that when people get anxious, they do these shallow chest breaths up here. Our most soothed place to breathe is down here in our bellies. And so maybe if you don't hear anything else today, take this with you, that if you or someone else is feeling anxiety, whether an anxiety attack or a panic attack, and they're starting to do those shallow chest breaths, you can help them move their breath to their belly. And the second you move your breath to your belly, it forces your whole body to calm down. I can't amp up my anxiety when I'm breathing out of my belly. And I'm doing it right now. I do this where I put a hand on my chest and a hand on my belly, and I see which one is going up and down. And typically, when someone is in one of these states too, and they're starting to have that shallow breathing, and they're having all of the physiological reactions to anxiety, if you can help them or yourself focus on your breathing and moving your breath, the awesome part is you can't also feel anxious about whatever it was you were feeling anxious about. I can't anticipate the future or what I was worried about when I'm focusing on my breath right now. I can't do both. So it's a 2-for-1. Let me see if there's anything else that I wanted to say here. On the right side, so an anxiety attack usually has specific triggers that may or may not be in someone's awareness, but typically we can walk back and identify what it was that triggered it. So maybe someone said something and then that triggered that feeling within me. Or maybe I saw something or I did something and then felt bad about it and that triggered that sense of anxiety. Anxiety attacks are usually a more gradual buildup. So we talk about like a wave. If you've ever seen a wave, you can see a wave building from a ways away. All waves eventually come up and then they crest. There are 0 waves ever that come up and then go on at the same intensity forever. So that's another kind of thing to help yourself or someone else to recognize that all anxiety and panic attacks eventually crest and come down. Our bodies are not capable of maintaining a high level of physiological distress for a long time. In fact, they think that our bodies can do it for about 15 to 30 minutes tops. Then our bodies naturally try to bring down that anxiety and that distress. Now, there are things that people can do to bump that back up, but our bodies really have a max capacity for how long we can be that distressed. So on the right-hand side, the panic attack, again, these usually happen without any warning. They're usually sudden or extreme. And the symptoms are usually intense but shorter. This is a shorter period of time where it surges up, and then, again, your body will force you to come back down. So, okay, next one, please. I just have a couple extra slides about anxiety because, again, this is one of the most common diagnoses and experiences that people have. These are 8 lesser-known anxiety symptoms. So these could be things that are maybe flags for you or for others to think like, well, maybe there's an anxiety issue going on. So things like striving for perfection, which also typically has a low tolerance for any mistakes or any problems. I'm just going to go down the left-hand side, being indecisive. So people who really get paralyzed by choices, there's typically an anxiety about, well, if I make the wrong choice, then what will happen? That kind of thing. People who are avoiding certain situations, we don't avoid for no reason. We typically are avoiding things because we're wanting to avoid discomfort or vulnerability or anything like that. In the middle, some maybe verbalizations of people thinking that other people are judging them. There's that ruminating on thoughts, so people who get stuck on something and have a hard time getting unstuck. I think of it as like a dog with a bone, that just like the more you try to pull that bone out of their mouth, they like hold on tighter. That's ruminating. Nausea and stomach issues, again, that's a really common physical expression for anxiety. That's one of the first signs, by the way, in kids. When they're feeling some anxiety, is some gastrointestinal problems. Difficulty concentrating, and then also that irritation, impatience, maybe anger. Okay. One more about this, just to go one step further. So anxiety is a number of different physiological symptoms, so things you're feeling in your body, but anxiety is really a lot of thoughts. It's your thinking about what might happen, what could happen, what's going on around you. So these are some typical types of thoughts that people might be experiencing if they're experiencing anxiety. So just wanted to put these out there in case that rings a bell for you. On the bottom left, questions like, well, what if? And really getting stuck on like the zillion of potential options of what might happen. Also, people tending to focus on like maybe the bad options only in the what if scenarios. Telling themselves that they're in danger, and sometimes our brains will tell us that in times that we know we're not in danger, but we feel like we're in danger. Anticipating that something bad will happen, telling ourselves that you're going to fail or mess up, telling ourselves you can't do this, saying something is wrong with me, like something must be wrong with me. That's why I'm having the kind of reactions that I'm having. And really negative self-beliefs, like I must be stupid or weird. That's why I'm experiencing these things. Okay, next one. One other one about social anxiety disorder. So I mentioned before that generalized anxiety disorder is all the settings, so it's really generalized. Social anxiety disorder is the opposite of that. It's really focused on one type of anxiety-provoking situation. So typically people who have social anxiety disorder can manage fairly well in a variety of other settings, but when it comes to social interactions, that's when their anxiety symptoms really spike. So here's just some examples of the kinds of experiences that people might have when they're confronted with a conversation with another person, when they're confronted with anything related to a relationship or being around others. You could see, obviously, that if someone experienced these types of symptoms in social settings, it would make sense that they would want to pull away. That's our natural human reaction, is avoidance when there's things that make us uncomfortable. So what might happen for someone that you may know that has social anxiety disorder is that they get so good at avoidance that they might avoid any social interaction. They might get so good that they are super creative and don't expose themselves to any kind of social situations. And so unfortunately what happens then is that the anxiety gets bigger. The more you avoid something, the more power it has over you. Okay, next one.
Are there simple things, are there some simple things you can, have conversation about that sort of thing, in particular with the social anxiety disorder type piece, in particular thinking to, talking with even your own kids or that sort of stuff around. Child seems to get very anxious around any sort of social type situation.
Yeah, so again, often people get really good at avoidance, right, and they might even get good at anticipating a social interaction. So it might even be like the thought of a social interaction makes them start to have those experiences. So depending on the level of distress, there's a couple things. One might be to talk through that before a social interaction. So let's just go through what might happen. Okay, what do you think you would feel if you met this person? Let's talk through that. So what that is kind of an exposure. It's a pre-exposure. You're trying to expose them to some of the things that they might experience and prove to themselves that they can manage it.
Right, because he's talking about anxiety being that future, that future piece, right?
Yes. And so also with anxiety, because this sounds old school now, but like playing the tape forward. Right. So sometimes with anxiety, it's really helpful to continue to play that out, because anxious people get stuck on the what if. And so typically what I'll do even in sessions with people is like, okay, well, let's play that out. What if that happened in the way that you're fearing? What would you do? And people are like, well, okay, well, I would do this and this. And typically when we play that tape forward, people have a realization of like, well, I actually could manage that. But when you get stuck on the what if, you're not even allowing yourself the opportunity to think through the whole thing and recognize your skills. So play the tape forward. And then the third thing I would recommend is highlighting like crazy any skills in tolerating that, because you want to build their confidence and build their confidence in the fact that they can manage it. So the more they believe they can't manage it, the more that anxiety flares. And if they can push back against that and have like a little bit of, well, I did talk to so-and-so yesterday and that was fine. Okay, so that's one example. That's amazing. You were able to do that. Now, how can we build upon that? Yeah, no problem. Okay, so another major category are depressive disorders. These are all the things here. And so I'm not going to go super into all of these, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the types of depressive disorders that are out there. On the top left is major depressive disorder. That's the big one. That's the one that is the most common amongst all of these, and is the one that has the most severe symptoms. So major depressive disorder could be one episode of severe symptoms lasting at least 2 weeks, or it could be multiple what we call recurrent episodes that last at least 2 weeks. So that is typically, I think, what people think about when they think about depression, is this major depressive disorder. The next one over, persistent depressive disorder, is kind of a half step down in severity. It's not quite as severe symptoms of depression, but it lasts longer and is more persistent. This used to be called dysthymia, if you've ever heard of that. But persistent depressive disorder is people who have chronic symptoms of not quite the severity of major depressive disorder, but lasting at least 2 years, and not really having any remittance in symptoms for that 2 years. Bipolar depression, so bipolar is another disorder, bipolar disorder, and bipolar disorder is made up of 2 poles, depression and then mania or hypomania. So depression is when the mood is low, mania and hypomania is when the mood is really high. And so in order to meet criteria for bipolar, you have to have both. You have to have some episodes of depression, and you also have to have some episodes of elevated mood. So either that mania, which is kind of in the mid-zone, or sorry, hypomania, which is in the mid-zone, or mania, which is more severe. So postpartum depression is obviously depression that's related to the time period during and post-childbirth. I believe the time period is during pregnancy and up to 2 years post-childbirth to meet criteria for postpartum depression. Premenstrual dysphoric disorder is when the symptoms of depression are tied to a woman's premenstrual cycle and the hormonal changes there. Seasonal affective disorder is when the depressive symptoms only occur in different seasons, and typically that season is winter, which we're in right now. Seasonal affective disorder is really responsive to things like light therapy and also medication therapy to kind of prevent people from going into that swing prior to the time period that they know those symptoms come up. And then atypical depression would be any depressive symptoms that don't meet any of the categories listed here. Any questions about this? Okay. All right, next one, please. Again, this is kind of small. I apologize for that. So these are signs and symptoms of depression. I'll read these. So obviously, I think what everyone thinks about when they think of depression are the persistent feelings of sadness. There's been some newer research where they've really pinpointed an aspect of depression is this sense of demoralization. So really feeling demoralized, like nothing will work. Nothing is good in my life. There is no hope to be had. It's a really distinct thing that's associated with depression. Loss of interest in activity, so people just don't have the motivation to engage in things. They also don't find pleasure in things that were pleasurable before. Sometimes sleeping goes in either way, either oversleeping, so people who are just fatigued and sleeping a lot, or people who have insomnia and are not sleeping at all. It's not like they're not tired, but they just can't fall asleep. It tends to go in either direction. Same with eating in depression. It tends to go in either direction. Some people lose their appetite and don't eat anything, and you might see them lose weight, and that be a sign of depression. Some people overeat and find themselves having increased hunger during depression, and obviously would have some results of that too. This fatigue, decreased energy, difficulty thinking clearly and quickly. So when we're depressed, it impacts our executive functioning. People cannot think as quickly. They have slower thinking processes. They even have slower body movement sometimes that are noticeable. Some people express irritability, frustration, pessimism. In fact, in children, that's one of the earlier signs, is more irritability. Children and adolescents is more irritability are signs of depression. Physical aches and pains. So again, this is that connection of the mind and the body. People feel it in their body. They feel bad in their body when they're feeling bad emotionally. And then this last one on the bottom right is recurrent thoughts of death and suicide. So when people are feeling that sense of demoralization, their minds naturally go to this place of thinking about not being here, or what if I wasn't here, and sometimes even farther in terms of planning that out or attempting. So, okay, next one. PTSD is another one that you maybe know some people who have experienced or have some experience with yourself. So PTSD is a disorder that is specifically associated with traumas. So unlike any other diagnosis that we have, in order to meet criteria for PTSD, you have to have an experience. You can't meet criteria for PTSD without having a traumatic experience. And that is defined as a situation in which your life or body are threatened, or someone else's life or body are threatened that you witness. So PTSD is really viewed as a disorder in which the past is intruding on the present. It's like we can't close the door on the past. It keeps coming up in the present, and I am reliving the past again and again and again. So the hallmark symptom of PTSD is this top one, what we call intrusive experiences. So the past is intruding on us in the present, and that could be in the form of thoughts, like a thought comes up related to the past. That could be an image that pops in my mind. That could be a physical sensation related to a past experience that comes into my body when I don't want it to. That could be an emotion. That also could happen when I'm sleeping in the form of nightmares. And about half of people who have experienced a trauma have recurring nightmares that are similar to the things that they experienced. So like an exact replica coming up in their sleep again and again. Flashbacks are just like nightmares, but you're awake. So a flashback is a situation in which you think you are back in the trauma event, but you're awake. And it's a super distressing experience. So the next category down is avoidance. So obviously, I've mentioned this before, when there are things that make us feel vulnerable or scared, our natural human reaction is to want to avoid those things. So people who have experienced traumas get very skilled at avoiding anything that reminds them of the trauma or traumas. And unfortunately, that grows. So let's just say it might start with an example of me avoiding a certain person. And then it might start with me avoiding all people of that same gender. Then it might go on with me avoiding all people. And then it might go on with me avoiding all interactions with people or leaving my house. So avoidance can grow and can be really dangerous. And maybe not most of the time, but a good portion of the time when people come to me for treatment, it's because those avoidance strategies have created additional problems for them. And then we kind of work back and we realize why they're avoiding, and it's because of the trauma. Another major avoidance strategy, about half of people who meet criteria for PTSD also meet criteria for a substance use disorder. So a lot of people are using substances to help them feel or not feel, or avoid whatever uncomfortable feelings they might be feeling. So a lot of times there's both things to address in terms of the problematic substance use and finding some other methods of coping with that distress, and then dealing with the traumas. The third one down is alterations in cognitions and mood. So this is just changes in how we think and how we feel. So when people experience a trauma at any stage of life, it changes how they think about themselves, how they feel about themselves, how they think about other people, how they feel about other people, how they think about the world, how they feel about the world. And sometimes those are changes that are not in healthy ways. So a common shift might be thinking that no one is trustworthy, or thinking that I am bad, or I am ruined, or I am dirty, or I am not worthy of love. Those kinds of shifts in thinking and behavior are the kinds of things that we work on in treatment. One other thing about that is there are people who have experienced traumas so early in their lives that there's no idea of what maybe was before the shift. They started out with some negative thoughts about themselves and others and the world. And so one of the things that also happens for people that have that experience is that any later trauma reinforces those beliefs. So let's just say I had early childhood trauma and I learned that people are not trustworthy. Then any experience I would have after that that's traumatic would reinforce that belief and make it even stronger. Like, see, no one is trustworthy. And so that's also a shift in a negative way in the sense that it's reinforced and causes problems in our lives. The last one down there is changes in arousal and reactivity. So as human beings, we are hardwired to respond with fight, flight, or freeze whenever we are threatened. When our bodies are threatened or when we perceive there to be a threat, us, just like all animals, are hardwired to respond in those ways. So when that happens, our arousal level surges up. Everything happens in our body to prepare for survival. So blood rushes away from the frontal lobes of our brain. It goes to our extremities so we can fight, so we can flight. All these things happen in order to protect us. The problem is, for many people who have experienced a trauma, is that surge in arousal level that happened during the trauma, that switch doesn't get flipped off. They remain in that state of high arousal, sometimes long after the trauma, years, decades even. And the toll that that takes on our body is extraordinary. Our bodies were not designed to remain at this feared state and to remain on guard and on edge for an extended period of time. So another major component of treatment sometimes for people is learning to turn off that switch. Because ideally, we want to turn on that switch when we need it. When I'm in danger, I want my body to respond like that. But I don't necessarily want my body to respond like that right now, when I know that I'm safe, or when I'm with my family, or when I'm at work. I want to be able to turn that switch on and off. And so for some people, it takes relearning how and when to turn on and off that switch. Any questions about that?
What about seeing terrible scenes like this last young man that died in Memphis? They say to watch that, how he was killed, it's terrible. That does not cause PTSD, right? You say it has to be something you experience.
Yeah, so actually there was a lot of research about this when 9/11 happened, because obviously people were distressed by the visual images of things that we were seeing from 9/11. But what they found in the research is that definitely that generates some significant distress and some symptoms from us, but not quite to the level of this. So in order to meet criteria for PTSD, for people who have directly experienced a trauma or indirectly through exposure, the magnitude of their symptoms is at a different level. And so, yeah, so seeing something like that definitely elicits some symptoms of distress in all of us. I think any human would. And obviously there's some variability in how people respond to that. For instance, I haven't seen that video, I don't know but if you already had a trauma and then you watch something like that, that could exacerbate and bring all that stuff back. So there's lots of different layers. Another kind of side note is back to social media a little bit, we are exposed to things at a level that we haven't been exposed to in previous centuries. And so there is some thought about what's the right word? I don't know, like our reactions to traumatic events now that we see, our emotional distance from those things because of how we're viewing it, and just how that might impact us as human beings. Yeah, I have little kids, and there's things that come up on the nightly news that I'm like, oh my gosh, I did not want to expose them to those images. I thought this was just, So there are things that I think are qualitatively different in terms of what we're exposed to on a trauma level now as a society compared to previous generations.
I think within social media, within
Yeah.
video games, within TV. I mean, I think too, the family viewing hour that used to exist, if your kids were watching TV, through like 7:30, in general, outside of maybe occasional scene or something on the news, you wouldn't have to be too concerned about things that would even come up within commercials. Yeah. But anymore, I mean, it can be any time of day, even in the morning, even on a Saturday morning, which Saturday morning cartoons don't exist in the same way that they used to when I was growing up. But, it's so different.
So different.
And I mean, as a parent, I have real concerns around some of the typical video games that my kids are flocking to because of the level of violence and reactivity. There are times I'm like, I'm not quite, there are things that as a parent, I often wonder, is the way they react related to maybe some of the things that they're not even thinking about. They're not even realizing their brain is processing, playing some of the video games and things that, video games it's one thing, but then we have to relate that back to real world and interaction interaction with siblings and,
Yeah.
other people. And I think there could be, and there are studies
Yeah.
out there, but, I think it's becoming a real issue. And I think it does get back to that level of exposure and the level of exposure that you would have never considered exposing children to, elementary, even by middle school. Thinking the movie ratings have changed
Yeah.
greatly, even since I was a child. That's, I think that there's some concern
Yeah.
as well. So.
We
Yeah.
become psychic numb to receive so much of it, we become
Right.
psychic numb.
Yeah.
Right.
The technical word is habituation, and it's when you're exposed to the same thing over and over that eventually you have less of a response to it. So like the idea of seeing a scary movie, the first time super scary, by the time you've seen it 10 times, it's less scary. So the same thing is potentially happening in our society, where we're seeing these scary things at a frequency that maybe we haven't seen before, at an age that maybe we haven't seen before. And so it remains to be seen how that might influence their reactivity to other stuff that should have a reaction, Yeah. So lots of stuff. Okay, next one, please. Again, this turned up a little small, but I like this slide because it talks about how untreated trauma might show up in all of these different ways. So I'm just going to go through this for a second. So I mentioned substance abuse, that about half of people who have experienced traumas and meet criteria for PTSD have substance use problems. Down to the bottom, depression. About 30% of people who meet criteria for PTSD also meet criteria for a depressive disorder. And that could be because there was a depressive disorder before that maybe was exacerbated by the trauma, or a lot of people experience symptoms of depression following a trauma, and that could become its own diagnosis. Anxiety, same thing. That could be something that was there before and was exacerbated by the trauma, or the symptoms of anxiety could be related to the trauma and are the things that are most noticeable. Health issues, people who have experienced traumas, there's lots of research that suggests that they have significantly more chronic health conditions, again, because of that relation between the brain and the body. People carry that pain in their body, and then there are consequences in their body because of carrying it. So lots of chronic pain, lots of gastrointestinal issues, lots of cardiovascular issues, lots of health issues that could be attributable. Social withdrawal, so again, people who their lives become very small, and maybe their lives were much bigger before experiencing a trauma. They maybe start to make that smaller and smaller to help themselves feel safe. Self-destructive behaviors, this could be any number of things. People are quite creative in their self-destruction. This could be obvious, I'm just looking to see if it's also on there. Yeah, it could be obvious suicidality. It could be self-harm attempts. It could also be doing things that are not healthy or safe for them. So maybe engaging in risky behavior or engaging in risky behaviors in general. And sometimes that's a reflection of not caring about oneself. Hostility, so sometimes people get stuck in that fight mode after a trauma and then start fighting everyone. Like they're trying so hard to protect themselves and feel safe that it's no longer about the trauma. Now it's about everything in life that they're trying to push back on and protect themselves. PTSD, obviously. Dissociation, this top one on the right, so you may not be able to tell, but that's a head in the clouds. So dissociation is a fancy word to mean distancing oneself from the present. So again, as human beings, we are hardwired to do this. This is actually a good thing for our brains to disconnect and for our bodies to disconnect in moments of intense pain. This is most common in children who have experienced a trauma that maybe are not capable of understanding the things that they're experiencing. And so their brains and bodies try to protect them by distancing. So they might not feel like they're in their body. They might not remember chunks of time. They might feel separate from their body. They might even feel like they are outside of their body, like a disconnect. And again, this happens in adults as well, and can happen in those same ways in which adults might feel triggered or maybe not even know that they're triggered, and their brain and body will disconnect from the present in order to protect them. Personality disorders, the next one down. So personality disorders are when aspects of your personality are impacted by the things that you've experienced. So much so that there are really pervasive patterns of problems in your ability to relate to other people, in your self-identity. Typically, people who have personality disorders have chronic instability in relationships, lots of problems engaging in and managing their own emotional distress or even knowing who they are. So sometimes, especially if people have experienced traumas early in life, that it might seep into their development of their personality and their ability to relate to other people. The next one down there is ADHD. ADHD is a separate diagnosis, but sometimes if people have experienced a trauma, it could exacerbate symptoms related to ADHD, make it really hard for people to concentrate or to be able to be present or to stay in the moment. And then I mentioned chronic pain again before about how our body holds on to that pain. Any questions about any of this? Okay, next one, please. Okay, so you might be, let me just check the time really quick.
It's 10:15.
Okay.
But I know that Amy said the schedule was fairly fluid. We technically have 30 minutes between
Okay. Wow.
the break time and the next workshop. So technically, as long as people have a few moments to be able to move to wherever they're going next.
Yeah.
But.
Okay. Maybe I'll just go through these slides real quick and skip and stop me if you need anything. This is just how to help yourself or others. So learning signs, we talked about that, learning some specific strategies, learning to set some boundaries, and learning how and when to refer. So I'll explain these in a second. Next slide, please. Okay, so how to respond if this is someone else. Language is very important, so we don't want to trivialize what they're experiencing. We don't want to be falsely positive. We don't want to give advice unless asked for. We do want to talk in a kind way and show concern and empathy and be polite and non-judgmental and encourage that they use resources. So can you skip ahead? Let's see. That's next one. Next one. Oh, just one note. I don't know what each of your roles are, but you're probably very skilled at supporting other people. So take your own advice. I know for myself, it comes naturally to help other people, but it does not come naturally to help myself. And sometimes I really have to be like, oh, what would I say to someone else? I'm going to say that same thing to myself. It sounds simple, but no. Okay, if you would skip ahead to the Bert Nash resources, if you would. Next one. Yeah, you can stop here. Okay, so this is just an overview of all of the things available at Bert Nash. It's a big community mental health center. We have 300 employees at this point, 100 of which were hired in the last year to try to manage just the demand for services. All kinds of services are available for adults and for children and families. Housing, a whole housing department, psychiatric medication services, which are really hard to find in the community, so we have those as well. Next slide. Next one. Okay, this is how to access services. If you or anyone you know is needing some mental health services, these are the best ways to access our services. You can walk in at our office on 200 Main, which is right across from LMH. You could call this 24-hour number. You also could complete initial paperwork on our website. That's the first step to initiating services. If you fill out that paperwork online, then our care navigators will call and set up an appointment. So.
I will say we've been very blessed with Baldwin City. We've had, I don't know for how long, but the Bert Nash RAP officer that's been present within the school system,
Yeah.
in particular at the junior high and high school level, has been so instrumental.
That's awesome.
In helping not only within the pandemic, but before that as well. So,
that's wonderful.
And to speak, positive that's been so good about it. Also, just giving space for kids to come together, not to necessarily always have a set agenda, but to give space for those kids that may not feel like they have a space.
Yeah.
And so, anyway, yeah.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, well, any final questions?
It's nice hearing all of this, very nice to hear all this.
Yeah.
But how do we help ourselves? So we need a program in 6 easy steps, 3 easy steps, right? No, and the breathing, I do yoga, so the breathing thing,
Yeah.
it really does help you. But I've also learned as I'm getting older, I'm thinking more of what's wrong with me and what I need to be doing. And I need to stop thinking about myself and think about what others are doing, going through out there. I mean.
Well, maybe
because-
not, because we can't help other people if we have an empty cup.
No, but you have to have a full cup to work.
Mostly full. I'd say mostly full.
Right, yeah, but I'm just saying that, for people in their 80s,
Yeah.
mental issues are probably different than, I mean, unless you
Yeah.
really have a mental issue, then I think that shows up in early age. But as you get older, no social life and that sort of thing can become
Yeah.
more of an issue
Yes.
with we people.
Well, we're human beings, and so
Yeah,
there are emotional
exactly.
reactions to every stage of life. And we wouldn't be human. It would be more concerning if there weren't some emotional reactions to those natural
Yeah,
stages
it
of
is,
life.
yeah.
So I think sometimes it's about recognizing and acknowledging and validating those reactions to the realities of those different stages. And it's recognizing when maybe those reactions are extreme, overwhelming, or unusual for that person.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
Okay.
you so much, Kirsten.
Yay!
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
I told
There's
you.
a lot to cover of basics.
I
Of
know.
Basics, mental health. I mean, gosh, you could have used the whole morning.
I
of
know.
workshop time. So
I try. I told you at the beginning I tried to jam a lot
Yeah,
into
no.
a little bit.
Thank you so much.
Very good.
Kirsten.
Okay. Yeah.
Really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you.